My King. The Chalice of Tribute. By M.R.Davenport. Copyright 2019. All rights reserved. From the author. My King is an allegory. An allegory, simply put, is using a story to teach a lesson. Much like a parable. Many allegorical passages in the Bible, however, are real-life stories. Because of the nature of this writing, the stories and adventures of Sir Miratus and Sir Cardicus may well become confusing. That was ne'er my intention. This story is written in an Old English prose. It uses many words that have old origins and are, for the most part, out of use. But they are still considered a part of our language. Latin is used often and, unless within a title, will be in italics for clearer definition. In a serious effort to avoid the reader becoming lost at any particular point, and upon the insistence of my editor, I have included a glossary at the end. I hope this alleviates any stress in reconciling the gist of the story. Keep in mind, the glossary is only available in the printed book. There's an old saying, "What's in a name?" Well, honestly, there is a great deal in a name. As you travel with our nightly heroes, you will see many names and references that may be hard to read or understand. Most names of places and people, and creatures, will have a Latin basis. You will find the explanations of these in the glossary. So, yes indeed, names are important. For instance, in the Bible, God is called God because there is little else with which to describe him in English. He is God. But if you delve into a solid word study on his name, you will often find that it is not always translated as it should. At different times the original word for God is more specific. It can be the same with us. In America we often prefer the name over the life blessing it may reproduce. And names can be a blessing or a curse. So you may find that when a new character is introduced, a quick reference to the glossary will give you insight into that person. Other books by this author. Hutch. Black Watch, 30 Days of Summer. Driver. Scribbles 31-Day Devotional and Journal, Love. As E. M. Oliver. Shadows of the Everstone Series. Book 1, Catchwood. Book 2, Of Giants and Monsters. 'Tis a fair thing I have done for you. 'Tis a fairer thing he has done for you. In immensity, and grander still. Sir Cardicus, Knight of the Albus Civitatus. Quia Rex Meus. For Adam, the man who spoke of my King. I sat there, still to listen and understand. A good word, from a good man. Words of faith and lessons true. 'Twas upon the pronounced, those few. A moment that struck as a reminder doth chime. Gentle and sweet, one and each at a time. Were such words the point of it all? As I live and ponder and grasp my recall. For the note that he conferred that blessed Sunday, I could not expound or begin to convey. Sure, I am, that it was of power and might. For God, in the least, maketh the day and the night. Yet in it all, I know the message he put to me. One of wonder and one of merciful decree. From which the story haileth and gives me to sing. A story beautiful of grace and the goodness of my King. Thank you, sir, and bless you in immensity, Matt. My king, the Chalice of Tribute. Chapter 1. The City of Ementia. It was an honor to be called to the palace, even as a knight these past many years, to be called up to meet the king face to face. I was elated. In my service, I had ne'er the chance to talk to him, to yet even meet him. Some of my brothers in arms told of the experience, but ne'er I, and, therefore, I were unaware of what to reckon upon it. The way there from my home was a while. 2 days. My faithful steed, Longwise, carried me since before I took a sword in hand. He again carried me that day as I said my farewells to those I fought for, what yet remained, and took out upon the road that would bear me to a new destiny. I hoped he would have a quest for me. 'Tis the criterion for the first time upon the realm's duty. Service to the king was a life of greatness, but a quest would write my name in the annals of time, providing I were to accomplish it. I took provision to supply me the journey to the city of Ementia, where the king's palace is, the dispatch communique, and headed forth along the nearby paths. Wagons seldom traveled to our part of the kingdom, so we had more trails than roads. Eventually I found my way upon the Bona Volontet, the highway that continued north toward Ementia. It was a good road, wide and easy. Still I was, as always, very careful. Longwise had been much in the stables of late and was clearly anxious to stretch his legs. It proved impossible to keep him at a gait, so I allowed him to run. The countryside around Patrice, my home village, was beautiful this time of year. The rolling hills covered with green grass that befits our land so well. Tall trees and a lofty blue sky. The wind was somewhat biting, but the journey would be long, so I continued to run Longwise. The first of my nights while in transit, was spent beside a small brook just a mile from the village of Apidville. The town was smaller than my own Patrice and offered no lodging nor other fare. It was yet a day's ride to the city of Ementia, so I was up early, well before daylight. I remained outside of the village to avoid distraction and having my travel slowed. Although I had served His Majesty these past 3 years as a knight, I had yet to meet him. Indeed, I had yet to see the city, or even take the journey there. Apidville was as close as I had come. Mine was a small lot in the kingdom, and I wished to increase it many-fold. There was nothing if not to be greater. The country changed ever so slightly as I progressed. I found it to be odd that the closer I came to the king's city, the less majestic the land appeared to be. It was disheartening. The road forced me to travel through a number of small settlements. Many seemed less than what I expected them to be, living in the king's valley. The people wore drab, poorly made, and unkempt clothing. Few beasts of burden, and fewer children. The crops that were on the way looked even less proper. The time of year that I journeyed should have shown healthy and strong wheat, corn, and fruit. The land looked badly nourished and starving. It grew worse the farther on Longwise carried me. After nearly another day of travel, the city proper came into view. On a hill raised up and steep, I exited the sickly trees that surrounded Bona Volontet. The land cleared, and there it was below me. Enormous as the sea. And covered in a cloud of rutty, ugly smoke. It was blackened and old-looking. Diminutive in color and dingy. My heart broke, for the view which I took in was nothing like what I had long imagined it to be. She was round about and enclosed by a mighty wall. There were many outlying villages that were bustling to some amount, but they were nothing like the fortress of the city. Roads led from all directions to the Great Wall, and each had an entrance. I imagined in my mind's eye the great distant lands those roads all led through, including the one I was upon now. Back to Patrice, my home, and beyond. Towering above all that were included within the wall, the great spires of the castle thrust up into the smudgy sky. It enticed me, and I was anxious to meet the king, so I spurred Longwise down the hill and charged the road, heading quickly to the opening that was most directly in my path. The thrill of the day's eventual outcome covering me like a knapsack and blinding out anything that didn't seem to fit the picture I had built within my own thoughts of what I would see this day. All other concerns now flushed with the image of my king in my head. The opening in the gargantuan wall that lay before me was wide enough for a dozen horses. And well needed. I followed a carriage into the city grounds as another was exiting. I wondered if all the openings were so large and how in the name of all that is that they defended them. The land surrounding the wall was full of activities beyond the imagination. As though a circus were there. But far more than just a few trained and caged, ferocious animals. Much of the enterprise were next to or near what seemed perpetual structures. As well as tents of every shape and size. Hundreds of people ran this way and that. It was like nothing I had seen before. The grounds were worn and, in some places, muddy from a fairly recent rain. There was little grass. And of such, brown and drab like the remains of the whole area. I greeted quietly all I passed. A tip of my homemade cavalier to the ladies and a simple nod to the men. I saw none that appeared to be any sort of nobility. Or jovial, for that matter. I got a few extra looks as my tam was a light blue. In fact, I wore my best and much of it was colorful. Something I saw little of around the city. Once inside the entrance, Longwise's shod hooves echoed a clop. It blended with the others that traveled about me. The cobblestone paving was a nice relief from the dirty, dusty routes we had spent the last 2 days upon. Indeed, the whole of life in Patrice. Though the castle seemed to be its city centre, I wound through many wide, industrious lanes, filled with people and bustling sales booths, to find my way to the king's residence. The smells were sometimes pleasant, but mostly bothersome. Every type of commodity in service was offered. From broken down carts and wagons, to meat, to the bordellos. It was prodigious to see. Those who were employed to fetch the sales were often directly in my path. A thing dear Longwise did not appreciate. Nor I for that matter. Usually a little rearing got them to move on. I was intent to see the king. I carried the letter from him requesting my presence. I would not let anything distract me from that course until it was run. Eventually, I found myself clear enough of the marketplace that I could pick up the gate safely without the fear of running a person down. The roadway and buildings curved slightly, and I found myself with a massive cross street. I took it to my left and marched directly to the castle grounds proper. The citadel did indeed stand tall and magnificent. But, like the rest of the city, a little drab and dingy. 'Tis a working castle. I reasoned with myself. The grounds around it seemed at odds with what the place was to be. A king's home should stand out, alone, aloof. But it was what it was. Indeed, I said aloud and spurred Longwise to the entrance. You, there. Halt. Off to my left a soldier approached. You cannot just wander your mongrel into the castle. What do you think this is? He wore a full chainmail, head to toe. A simple white and black frock overlay it. And a shabby sword at his side. He was overdressed. A chainmail at the castle front. Many pardons, squire. I was unaware. Call me squire again, outlander, and I shall pull you from your dog and learn you what it takes to guard the king's castle. He was now angry. Or, he seemed as such. I felt it would not improve my circumstances to repay in kind. I acquiesced as best I could. In that case, 1,000 pardons, my liege. I meant no disrespect, honestly I did not. Of course, that was not true. He insulted the finest horse in Patrice. Still, I needed to be about my business. "What do you need?" he demanded. I held up my dispatch from the king that I had already retrieved, expecting just such a question. "I am to meet with the king." I said it loud enough that anyone in earshot could hear. It was a proud moment for me. I thought I should be treated at least a tad bit better. He took the scroll from my hand and unrolled it. "Ha!" He looked up at me. "'Tis your first time here, no doubt." He posed it as a question. "Yes. But it shan't be my last." As though that would cause a gentleman to suddenly appear. It did not, of course. "Stable the beast, then proceed." He pointed down the lane to the east. Opposite I'd come. I resisted asking if he were the stable boy. That would have gotten me flogged, I fear. "How far be yet the stables?" "Does not matter. There are a dozen. Pick as you desire," he said as he turned back to the entrance of the castle. I walked longwise down the cobbles to the first paddock we came to. A sign on the front gate said it was 4. As did the next 4. Finally I arrived at the first to have nary a sign and inquired at such as to them having room about. The man stood looking at me. He was shabby to the greatest degree. He seemed to have bathed in rather than mucking the stalls. "Do you see a sign saying otherwise?" Was this city full of the demented and cross? The only smiles I had cast upon were worn by those trying to sell me creation. "You're a snip as the guard was, aren't you?" He smiled. I dismounted. "Please take care of him. Some grass? Or grain if you have it. Not much though? I suspect we shall be on our way quickly. The king has a post for us." I went about handing the reins to the man. "And a rub down with hay or straw." He refused to move. 5 pence for the remainder of the day. 10 for the grain." "What?" I interrupted. "I am a knight of the realm, you fool. How dare you demand of me?" He ne'er quit his smile. "I understand. There be around 50 or 60 today." He spoke some sloppy enunciation I was helpless to grasp and handed the reins back. "You needn't be forced about it." He pointed farther down the lane. "There are 5 more stables long here. Bit in other parts of the city." He smiled bigger. "We all charge the same." It took less than 5 minutes to prove he was being truthful on the matters of cost. I returned. He now had the full sign out front. I went to the next. 5 pence for the remainder of the day, he said. I handed him the 5 and the reins. "I should like him rubbed down." "How much?" I inquired. "Should be 15 for you the rub, but I'll take 15 for both the rub and the stall." I handed him the rest of the pence and proceeded towards the castle. I did not expect to purchase lodging for the horse. There weren't a lot of ready cash in my pocket. As a knight I expected to be treated with honor and welcomed into the city. But I was clearly mistaken. The guard at the palace entrance was different. His dress the same, his demeanor as well. I pulled the king's scrolled dispatch from my satchel and handed it to him. He allowed me to pass with a smile. At first I thought it was one that bid me a good day. Then I understood it to be of sarcastic humor. As though I was in derision. A jester? I looked about myself in unfit gall and turned to go through the gigantic, boisterous gates. It was an enormous place. A variety of ante-room entrances and hallways spread about. I turned about again and asked the guard, which direction should I point myself? He smiled. "Follow the line, your lordship." I did my best to ignore his oblique mockery. "The line?" I queried him again. "The line?" He turned to watch others approaching from various directions. 'Twas a very busy street. He pointed over his shoulder with the thumb upon his right and offered no further elucidation. I had it not within me to further withstand his discourse, so I returned and walked forward to the gaping entrance. Many and varied were those I passed. Few appeared to wear much more than a simple smock or tunic. And, mostly, drab. No one appeared to dress for the palace as I had expected. Inside the castle, which was made from the same dull, slate-colored stone as the great, outer wall, I found bulwarks far off to my left and right with a singular door in each. To my front, the structure opened to a number of halls and a few more walls with doors. 5 in all. The halls, that is. All of equal width and height. A rounded archway top. Between the center one and the next outer 2, were doors. 2, 1 in each. Hanging here and there, almost haphazardly, were great tapestries. Their colors appeared to exist, but greatly faded. To the point they no longer had a significant image or meaning. I looked down the halls. I saw no line. I searched the floors and the walls and walked to the first great hall on my left. It did not lead to anything in particular, and was completely uninhabited. Then back to the next one. It was identical. Then the center. No change. And so on. Finally, the last one, to the far right side, was awash in noise and activities. I do not know how it was that I heard nothing afore I got there. The design of the ceilings baffled the sound, I suppose. This hall was a wonder to behold. Massive as the others. None different in size or design. But very busy. At the far end a massive table existed. 6 men sat there facing upon me. At the right side, in front of the man at that end of the table, a long line of men in a variety of clothing styles and colors stood. At least 30 to 40. As well a few scattered in front of the others, but nothing like the right side. I continued searching for the line I was to follow. As I did so, a man bumped me as he passed by heading inward. He apologized, and I stopped him. "Could you apprise me of the whereabouts of the line we are to follow?" I asked. He looked at me. "Are you a child?" He laughed out loud and pointed to the line of men waiting to be seen at the table. The line of people, I thought. How foolish of me. He continued on, and I followed, taking my place at the end of this line. I was not, apparently, the only one to meet the king this day. At least he did not call my folly to the attention of the others. I spoke to none while I waited. If all were to see the king that day, he would likely have much on his plate. I knew that it was not every day that one is sent on a quest. But my letter only requested my presence. It was not a guarantee that I was to be about a quest. It was an interminable amount of time that I stood there. My legs were immensely sore. Yet I complained not. Regardless, I was indeed in a most honorable position to have this summon. Longwise and I had arrived to the palace in the early afternoon. Apparently, it was rather a process to continue from here. As each was seen, first by the individual at the far right of the table, they moved to another. Once there, they were tended to and dismissed. After a time, a number of others gathered behind me. An hour into the wait, while I was still 10 or more from the table, the man we were all in line to talk to stood to his feet. He leaned a little off to his right side to look down the line of men. "Stolidus!" he yelled out across the colossal hall. From behind us, we all heard the echo of running feet. "Yes, my lord." The owner of the clamoring feet yelled back as he approached. He was dressed similar to the guard outside. "Go and tell Pretus to refuse entrance the remainder of the day. he blurted out, pointing to the entrance of the castle. "Yes, my lord." He'd barely stopped when he turned to rush back to pass along the instructions. From behind me, I overheard another in line. "'Tis the most anxious guard I have ever seen." To which several tittered. We returned our attention upon the master at the head of our line. It would prove to be another hour before I was called to him. He wore a cloak of mixed, drab colors. It seemed less his station. I would have expected him to be garishly robed. Even his velvet-encrusted Tudor was out of place for a house of royalty. But it seemed to be what I was to come to expect in a city that appeared dingy. He paid me little mind and stuck his hand out to me while still in conversation with the last knight, as he had been sent to the man on the far end of the massive table. I placed my scroll in his hand. He summarily unrolled it, and laid it before himself. "Your name?" he asked without looking up at me. "Sir Miratus, of Patrice," I pronounced, proudly. The man looked upon me as if I were some kind of fool. "Patrice?" he chortled. A glance back at the scroll and he scribbled some nonsense upon the lower part. His signature, I derived. "Step off to the end," he said, suddenly pointing to his right. He rolled the scroll back up and handed it to me, yet smirking. Why it was handled so quickly and most of the others took time, I learned. They were upon return treks from a quest. I had thought for a moment to thank him, but it seemed fruitless and, doubtless, would be unobliged. The gentleman's disposition appeared to have been left at the great door which Pretus now disallowed entrance. Possibly the beginning of the ramp before encountering him altogether. I arrived at the far end of the table and got into a much smaller line, with only 2 occupants in front of me. In moments I was again before another man in elaborate, yet garishly plain, garb. He took the scroll, as the last man had, and in the same fashion, signed an illegible name upon the base of the vellum. "Proceed to Lord Litremet's office for assignment." He initially instructed me in a plain, boorish voice with no actual directions. Apparently, the vacant face with which I responded alerted him to my poor terror lack in the realm. So he added a succinct point towards the rear of the hall. "Out the door, to your far right. Lord Litremet. Go?" I took the scroll and proceeded. A few cackles were emitted by the other, apparently more well-seasoned, knights as I followed the directions given me. I departed the great hall and found, within the massive foyer that I had traversed earlier, the 2 doors to right and left did, indeed, have writing upon the top edge. With closer inspection, I found the one on the right to have Lord Litremet's name carved within it, of which was of a standard size. The wall extended so high, I thought it possible I could not see the end of it. And likely 25 cubits in each direction. No tapestries, no windows, no other doors, were within it. The door did, indeed, seem tiny by comparison. It was wooden with heavy iron works that appeared to hold it in place. I knocked. None within responded. I knocked again. There was still no response. I knocked harder. Silence. "Just enter, you knave." A voice behind me spoke. I did not appreciate being called such for the simple pleasure of someone incapable of being even slightly polished. I spun on my right heel, my hand swinging to the hilt of my blade, and looked upon the purveyor of the insult. It was the man who had occupied the table. The first I had come to. He saw my actions before I saw that it was he. "A knave indeed," he said. "You shan't live long in your quest if you learn not to respond so quickly and without care." He seemed a much more formidable opponent now standing still. "Open the door and proceed forthwith, young man, or you shall find yourself going home with your bungled dreams smashed to bits." He looked away and continued his march from the confines of the great room and castle. He was right, of course. But I was still the fool? My anger ceased only because I did indeed wish to be on with my quest. The mission set before me. That which would make me great among the annals of the kingdom. I acted as if it had not occurred and entered the office of Lord Litremet. The room was not as I had expected it to be. A low ceiling with a multitude of pillars supporting such. I could nearly reach up and touch it. The room was quite large. Much longer than it was wide. And it seemed to be the full width of the outer wall. The room was garishly decorated. The greatest brightness I had encountered since arriving in the king's home. At that far end, a large piece of furniture sat. It was like a table, but somehow different. A man sat behind it. Lord Litremet, I presumed. Being distracted by the odd ceiling height, the decor, and the size of the room, I hadn't noticed one idle point. It was filled of others. Knights, I presumed. Much as myself. Waiting, no doubt, for a quest. That all-important task, to send them out to achieve at the risk of their lives. The gentleman which sat behind the large table saw my entry and gasped. Really? Is there no end to you quest hunters? He motioned me forward. It was quite a jaunt across the floor to his table. Lord Litremet. I acknowledged as I came to a stop before him. Ha! He scoffed. No, knave. I really did not like that word. The Lord Litremet hasn't time to deal with all you busy-bodied quest hunters. He has more important duties to fulfill. He stuck his hand out to take the scroll, opened it, and began writing something upon it. He dipped his quill a number of times. Finally, he looked up at myself. Your name? Sir Miratus. Of Patrice. He dipped the quill again and wrote it down upon another piece of parchment. Sit down. I shall call you as soon as it is possible. He glanced about the room of at least 100 others. Which I doubt it shall be today. I looked at the others. Many of which were watching me and the man at the table. Will it be this week? I asked, smiling. I do not have time for your ridiculous humor. Sit, squire. Knight. He pointed to the chairs. I looked for a full minute before finding a place that was not occupied. It was on a long, uncushioned bench. There were already 2 of whom sat there. One at each end. I bowed, as a true knight would, in introduction. Miratus. I presented my name. The first of the 2 barely acknowledged myself. He looked at me then back to the rest of the room. It was no doubt that the position we all shared was uncomfortable and difficult. But to be so rude as to not even return a greeting was unacceptable. I am Amika. The knight spoke from the other end. He stood and returned my bow. Of Proculars. To the east. I shook his proffered hand. From Patrice. To the south. I sat between the 2. Most of the men in the room spoke with someone, just to pass the inordinate time. Amika and I continued our conversation. He explained that this was his second quest. His first had consisted of fetching the Fleece of Rectitude. It was an impossible task. Though I fought bravely, I failed. But I learned much in the process. We continued to discuss the finer points of our life within the realm and the desire to meet the king. Others mentioned that they had met him. But upon a greater inquiry, it proved perjures. Which vexed me that it came to them so facilely. One by one, men were called to be given their pursual. They each took their new scroll and gleefully left the room. Another 6 men entered after I. It was a dilatory proceeding. At length, and near 40 without a scroll, we were instructed to return the next morning. Of which, I was ill prepared. With the quest came a small stake to supply one in the travel. Without a quest yet, I would be sleeping, recurrently, upon the ground. I became resigned at the realization that I would be doing so, mostly as I am about the quest nevertheless. Amika invited me to remain with him. He, at least, had a tent established upon the eastern lawn. Well, it was more of a muddy plot than a lawn. An ugly area I passed as I entered the city proper. I gave it no mind to speak of then, but now that I approached it, I found 'twas nothing as I had expected to find outside of the great city of Ementia. The king's own city. We both gathered our mounts from the poshly stables and trekked out the city walls to the Magna Gramina. The tents were gathered in a great circle within a circle. Within another. And so on. Hundreds of tents. Most of them only the size a single knight would carry. His was deep within the pile. It is well insulated. He looked at me as we weaved between the others. Not the variance of chance a scoundrel or rogue would venture this far to steal. Nary a copper. Momentarily, we found his tent. It lay within a pile of possessions on the muddy ground. Cursed! He yelled, kicking the wet dirt, flinging it here and there. Is there some amiss? I asked. Both honestly and comically. A great deal, indeed, seemed to be amiss. Yes. He conceded. But mostly, the flagitious tore it down. He gritted his teeth and curled his fists. Miscreants. He gathered his belongings, and we worked to load what was left upon his horse, Feather. 'Tis all right, my friend. We shall find something without the crowded mud hole. I encouraged. It was the crowded mud hole that made it safe to leave in place. He snickered silently. Which, now I see, is not that safe to begin with. We did, indeed, find a place outside the other circles to set up. The tent had been slightly damaged, but not enough to keep it from doing as it was intended. Amika and I shared what little we had for food, and night fell around us. As morning began, we closed the tent in a simple plication and loaded it upon Feather. We found our way into the inner stables and left our steeds in the care of the same lesser equerry. The guard wanted our letter to look upon. He had to check our names against a list that Lord Litramet's man had sent. Finally, we were allowed entrance into the castle. Whereby we found ourselves, being amongst the earlier risers, resting quietly in a more agreeable chair, once again, awaiting our quest. In no more than an hour, my new friend and fellow knight was called upon. He had explained that it was rude to inquire after one's quest. So, of course, I was left with not knowing dear Amika's destination. I did, still, encourage and prod him to be incontestable about his forthcoming charge. You will succeed this time without a doubt. I shook his hand. I shall find my way to Proculus someday and look for you, my friend. I do look forward to it. He smiled. Thank you for your conviviality and generosity, I said as he left my presence. I resumed my chair and waited until midday before the man at the table called my name. I stood before him, scarcely before he completed saying it. My good man, where is it that you are sending me? He looked up from what was quite an enormous pile of parchment and skin. He tried to smile. He was a very put-away and sorrowful man. He pulled a sheet from the stack purely at random. He ne'er took his eyes from mine. It seemed to be some kind of act of rebellion. One, the likes of which, had little to no planning whatsoever. Without discerning what the quest was, he gave it to me. I looked at it. He pulled it from my hand. He looked at it, frowning, and then handed it back. He began writing something down. He stopped and looked back at me. "My deepest apologies," he muttered. "For the records." He handed over a scrawny leather satchel that contained my pecuniary abetment. The coins chinked of lac. Paltry by any measure, but none the more than I would need. My heart and mind raced. I had my quest. But at the same time, I fought within myself to understand the whole process. How ridiculous it was to observe. At the rate with which he wrote, the assignments could be in place for each person in just a matter of an hour. Or less. He pointed to the door. "Begone, you young rapscallion." The room about me erupted in laughter as I chambered my quest wherewithal. I even found myself giggling. I did indeed charge the door with thanks and was all the way to Longwise before I presumed to know where I was bound. I pulled my faithful from the stables and prepared him for the trip. Once he was ready, I took the skin, which I had rolled and stuffed within my haversack, and read it. A small effigy had been scraped upon the pelt. It was some form of a goblet, but in a strange and hard to recognize form. "The Chalice of Tribute." I read aloud. "Your quest is to obtain it at all costs. If you fail, make certain it cannot be used." I looked at Longwise. "'Tis a great deed we are set to, my old friend." I looked again at the old skin. The only direction that the quest gave us was to travel the southbound upon the Arbitrium highway ending in what appeared to be an island. I mounted Longwise and spurred him forward. Patrice was to the south. We will swing into home and proceed from there. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision. For the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. Joel 3:14.